In the scorching summer of 1873, the small, sun-baked town of Dusty Creek, Texas, witnessed an event that would be whispered about for decades. It began when a solitary figure pushed through the swinging doors of the local saloon, bringing with him a silence that suffocated the room's usual raucous laughter. He was a man carved from shadows, dressed entirely in black dusters that seemed to absorb the dim light. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe, and his skin was the color of deep obsidian. But it was his eyes that froze the patrons in their tracks, eyes that held no warmth, only the cold, dead weight of a graveyard. He did not ask for a drink. He did not look for a seat. He walked with terrifying purpose toward a table in the back, where a man named Thomas Birch sat gambling. In less than 60 seconds, the stranger drew a heavy revolver with lightning speed and placed a single bullet between Birch's eyes. Before the smoke had even cleared or the other men could reach for their holsters, the stranger turned and vanished into the blinding white heat of the afternoon. This was not a random brawl, it was an execution. It was the first thunderclap in a storm of vengeance that would claim 18 lives. The shooter was Zachariah Creed, a man born into chains, a boy who had escaped hell, and a ghost who had returned to collect a debt written in blood. To understand the darkness that lived inside Zachariah Creed, one must look back 15 years prior, not to the saloon in Dusty Creek, but to the source of the rot. The story truly begins in 1858 on the Whitmore Estate, a sprawling cotton plantation 40 miles west of Houston. The master of this domain was Colonel Henry Whitmore. The title was a fabrication. Whitmore had never seen a day of battle in his life, but like many wealthy southern planters, he adopted military honorifics to veneer his greed with respectability. He owned 3,000 acres of fertile Texas earth and held the deeds to 112 human souls. To the outside world, Whitmore was a pillar of southern gentility, a man whose cotton fetched top dollar in New Orleans and whose dinner parties were the envy of the county. But the newspapers that praised his prosperity never printed the truth of its cost. They did not speak of the whip-scarred backs that harvested the wealth, nor the families fractured on the auction block like livestock. Colonel Whitmore was a man who viewed human beings as farm equipment, depreciating assets to be worked until they broke. Beneath the polished mahogany and fine silk of the Whitmore Estate lay a foundation of absolute brutality. In this world, cruelty was not an accident, it was the engine of industry. Zachariah was born into this machinery of suffering in 1847. His mother, Abigail, was a domestic servant who worked within the suffocating orbit of the main house. She was a woman of profound, quiet strength, known among the enslaved community for a singing voice that could pierce the heaviest despair. She sang old spirituals, hymns passed down through generations that spoke of rivers to cross and chariots swinging low, codes of hope in a hopeless place. For young Zachariah, his mother's voice was the only shield he had against the ugliness of his existence. It was Abigail who gave him his name in the hushed dark of their cabin. Zachariah, she would whisper, smoothing the hair from his forehead. It means God remembers. You hold on to that. No matter what they take from us, no matter how deep they cut, God remembers every injustice. She was trying to plant a seed of faith in him, a belief that a cosmic scale would eventually balance. But Zachariah's father was already gone, sold to a cane planter in Louisiana when the boy was barely 3 because Whitmore wanted to expand his acreage. The lesson Zachariah learned early was not about divine justice, but about the terrifying liquidity of his own life. He learned that people could vanish simply because a white man signed a paper. By the age of 5, Zachariah had been conscripted into the plantation's labor force. He was too small for the cotton rows, so he became a runner, fetching water, gathering eggs, and sweeping the verandas where the Whitmore family sat sipping iced tea. He became invisible, a living tool expected to anticipate needs before they were spoken. The Whitmore children, 2 sons and a daughter roughly his age, treated him with the casual cruelty of children who are taught that they are a superior species. They threw stones at him, mocked him, and treated him like a stray dog. If Zachariah reacted, if he cried or showed anger, he was whipped. This was his primary education, the suppression of self. He learned to lock his soul in a small iron box deep within his chest. He learned to make his face a mask of blank obedience, showing nothing, feeling nothing, revealing nothing. This stoicism was not natural, it was a survival mechanism forged under the threat of pain. The plantation was a world of arbitrary violence, where a wrong look could result in a lashing, and Zachariah was a quick study. He watched, he listened, and he remembered, his young mind recording every insult and every blow with the precision of a court stenographer documenting a crime. The enforcer of this brutal regime was the overseer, Thomas Birch. Birch was a man from the bottom rung of white society, looked down upon by the landed gentry as white trash, yet useful to them for his capacity for violence. Birch had found his calling in the infliction of pain. He carried a braided leather whip weighted with lead shot at the tip, a weapon designed to flay skin from bone. Unlike some overseers who viewed punishment as a necessary chore, Birch derived a sickening pleasure from it. He smiled when the whip cracked. He hummed to himself while he cleaned the blood from the leather at night. He was the devil in Zachariah's world, a looming predator who smelled of stale tobacco and sweat. Birch was paid well to break spirits, to ensure that the human machinery of the Whitmore Estate remained docile and productive. He liked to say that he was teaching lessons, but everyone knew the truth. He enjoyed the power of playing God over the bodies of others. Zachariah terrified him, though he would never admit it. Even at 7 years old, the boy didn't look at the ground when he was struck. He looked at the horizon. But Birch was determined to break him, just as he had broken countless others. The day that shattered Zachariah's world and birthed the monster within him was a Tuesday in August, 1854. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the Texas plains until the air shimmered like liquid glass. Inside the main house, Abigail was rushing to serve the midday meal. She carried a heavy ceramic pitcher of milk, her hands slick with perspiration from the oppressive humidity of the kitchen. As she entered the dining room, the pitcher slipped from her grasp. It crashed against the polished hardwood floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces and sending white milk splashing across the room. It was an accident, a trivial, meaningless mistake. But Mrs. Whitmore, the colonel's wife, reacted as if she had been physically assaulted. She screamed in rage, not because of the mess, but because her property had failed her. She demanded punishment immediately. She called for Thomas Birch. In the twisted logic of the plantation, a broken pitcher was an act of rebellion that required a blood sacrifice. Zachariah was outside sweeping the dust from the porch when he heard his mother's voice rise in a plea for mercy. The sound turned his blood to ice. Against every rule he had been taught, against the instinct for self-preservation, he dropped his broom and ran toward the screams. The scene that awaited him in the rear courtyard would be burned into his retinas forever. Thomas Birch had tied Abigail to the whipping post, her dress stripped down to expose her back. Colonel Whitmore stood nearby, arms crossed, looking bored, while his wife fanned herself, her face twisted in a sneer of disgust. They were the audience for a play they had seen 100 times. When Birch raised the whip, Zachariah tried to lunge forward, to throw his small body between the leather and his mother, but a stable hand grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into the dirt. "Watch, boy," the man hissed. "You watch and you learn." And so, Zachariah was forced to witness the murder of the only person who had ever loved him. Birch struck with the precision of a butcher. The whip cracked, and Abigail screamed, a sound that ripped through the heavy summer air. 1 blow, 2, 5, 10. The milk on the dining room floor was forgotten. This was about domination. Birch didn't stop when she fainted. He didn't stop when the skin gave way. He struck her 37 times. Zachariah counted every single stroke, his lips moving silently, etching the number into the bedrock of his mind. When Birch finally lowered his arm, exhausted from the exertion, Abigail hung limp against the ropes. The Whitmores turned and walked back into the house to finish their lunch, stepping over the blood in the dirt as if it were nothing more than spilled wine. They left her there in the sun. The slaves were forbidden to cut her down until nightfall, a final act of desecration intended to serve as a warning to the others. By the time they carried her to the cabin, the fever had already set in. The trauma was too severe, the blood loss too great. Abigail died just before dawn, holding Zachariah's hand. She tried to whisper her son's name one last time, to tell him again that God remembers, but the words caught in her throat. She died in silence. Zachariah did not cry. The tears would not come. Instead, a cold, hard stone formed in his chest where his heart used to be. The boy named Zachariah died that night alongside his mother. In his place, something else began to grow, a vessel of pure, distilled hatred. He was sent to the cotton fields the very next morning, his small hands torn by the bolls, the sun beating down on his neck. But as he worked, He made a vow. He promised the ghost of his mother that he would not wait for God to remember. He would do the remembering himself, and one day he would make them all pay. The years that followed Abigail's death were a blur of agony and relentless labor. By the time Zachariah was 9, the plantation had carved its map into his flesh. The cotton fields of the Whitmore Estate were not merely a place of work. They were an altar where human bodies were sacrificed to the god of profit. The sun blistered his skin until it peeled and bled, and the sharp husks of the cotton bolls sliced his fingers until his hands were a patchwork of calluses and scars. He was whipped for not meeting quotas that were impossible for a child to meet. He was whipped for moving too slowly. He was whipped simply because Thomas Birch was bored. The scars on his back began to weave together, forming a grotesque tapestry of raised keloids that stiffened his movements. Yet, through the haze of pain, the overseers began to notice something unsettling about the boy. Most slaves, when beaten enough, developed a hollow, vacant stare, the look of a spirit that has fled the body to survive. Zachariah was different. His eyes never dulled. They burned with a cold, intelligent hatred. He didn't look down. He watched. He memorized faces, habits, and weaknesses. Birch once remarked to a stable hand that the boy had the devil sitting right behind his eyes, a premonition that was more accurate than he could ever know. Whatever flickering light of humanity remained in Zachariah was tied to a single, fragile thread. His younger sister, Grace. She was 6 years old, a small, terrified child who clung to him as her only protector in a world of wolves. After their mother's death, Zachariah had become her father, mother, and guardian. He stole extra scraps of cornbread for her when the rations were short. He shielded her from the cruelty of the older children. At night, in the stifling heat of the slave quarters, he would whisper stories to her, not the biblical tales of deliverance their mother had loved, but stories of a place beyond the horizon where no one owned anyone. Grace was the only person who could make the corners of his mouth lift in a smile. She was the only reason he hadn't yet tried to kill an overseer and gotten himself hanged. She was his anchor. But on a plantation, love is a liability. It is a weakness that masters exploit with surgical precision. Colonel Whitmore knew that stripping a slave of their connections made them easier to control, or perhaps he simply needed the money for a new carriage. The reason didn't matter. In 1859, the ledger was balanced, and Grace was the currency. The day the carriage arrived, the air was thick with the smell of impending rain. A man named William Crawford stepped out, a slave trader from Houston dressed in a suit that cost more than Zachariah would ever earn in 10 lifetimes. Crawford was a man of business, clinically detached, viewing the people before him as livestock to be appraised. He walked the line with Colonel Whitmore, checking teeth, squeezing muscles, and discussing temperament. When he pointed a gloved finger at Grace, Zachariah felt the world tilt on its axis. He stood frozen, paralyzed by the absolute powerlessness of his station. He watched from 20 feet away as 2 white men haggled over the price of his sister's life. They settled on $400. That was the sum of her existence. As the money changed hands, the reality shattered the moment. 2 overseers grabbed Grace, dragging her toward Crawford's wagon. She screamed for Zachariah, her small voice cracking with terror. "Zach! Zach, don't let them!" He broke then. He ran toward her, a 9-year-old boy throwing himself against the weight of a system built to crush him. The butt of a rifle slammed into his skull before he could reach her. He fell into the dirt, darkness swimming in his vision, the last sound in his ears, the fading cry of his sister as the wagon rolled away. He never saw her again. With Grace gone, the anchor was cut. Zachariah drifted into a deep, silent rage, a dark ocean where he drowned every soft emotion he had left. The only thing that kept him from total collapse was Samuel. Samuel was a boy his own age, but in spirit they were opposites. Where Zachariah was a closed fist, Samuel was an open hand. Samuel still laughed. He still found wonder in a peculiar beetle or a strange cloud formation. He was the plantation's dreamer, a boy who believed that goodness could not be wholly extinguished, even here. They became inseparable, brothers forged in the fire of shared trauma. At night they lay on the dirt floor of the cabin, and Samuel would weave elaborate fantasies of escape. "We'll go west," Samuel would whisper, "past the cotton, past the rivers, to the mountains. They say a man can breathe free in the mountains." Zachariah didn't believe in freedom, but he listened because Samuel's voice kept the screaming in his head at bay. Samuel was the last vestige of the boy Zachariah could have been, the part of him that wasn't consumed by the desire to kill. But the year 1860 brought a tension that vibrated through the very soil of Texas. Talk of war was everywhere. The North and South were baring their teeth, and the subject of slavery was the bone between them. Colonel Whitmore, sensing the shifting tides, tightened his grip. Discipline became draconian. The slightest infraction was met with severe punishment to discourage any thoughts of rebellion inspired by the rumors of abolition. In December of that year, hunger drove Samuel to make a fatal mistake. It was a single piece of bread, stale and hard, stolen from the kitchen trash to feed a sick child in the quarters. That was the crime. The punishment was death. Whitmore decided to make an example, a spectacle to terrify the workforce into submission. He gathered every slave on the estate in front of the main house. He stood on the porch, a Bible in one hand, and spoke of the sin of theft, of the divine order of masters and servants. He spoke with the calm, terrifying rationality of a man who believes God is his accomplice. They hanged Samuel from the ancient pecan tree that stood at the edge of the yard. It was a clumsy, amateur execution. Thomas Birch placed the noose, his face devoid of anything resembling pity. When they kicked the crate away, Samuel didn't die instantly. The fall was too short to snap his neck. He strangled. He kicked and thrashed, his eyes bulging, his hands clawing at the rope that bit into his throat. It took 5 agonizing minutes for the life to leave him. Zachariah was forced to stand in the front row. He was forced to watch his only friend, the boy who dreamed of mountains, turn into a swaying corpse. He didn't look away. He burned every second of it into his memory. He memorized the way Whitmore checked his pocket watch, bored by the duration of the dying. He memorized the way Birch spat on the ground when it was finally over. He memorized the silence of the other slaves, a silence heavy with grief and terror. When Samuel finally went still, something inside Zachariah didn't just break, it solidified. The last barrier holding back the monster was gone. Whitmore ordered the body to remain hanging for 3 days as a grim billboard for his authority. For 3 days, Zachariah walked past the rotting corpse of his friend on his way to the fields. He saw the carrion birds circling. He saw the flies. On the 3rd night, under the cover of a cloud-choked moon, Zachariah crept out of the cabin. He had stolen a rusted knife from the blacksmith's refuse pile. He cut Samuel down, the body stiff and heavy in his arms. He carried him to the soft earth near the creek and dug a shallow grave with his bare hands, tearing his fingernails until they bled. He didn't pray. The God his mother spoke of, the God who remembered, seemed to have abandoned this place long ago. Instead, Zachariah made a promise to the dirt. "I will live," he whispered to the silence. "I will live to kill them all." He covered Samuel's face, stood up, and turned his back on the only home he had ever known. He didn't pack food. He didn't take water. He just ran. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. He scrambled under the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of the Whitmore Estate and plunged into the raw Texas wilderness. He was 13 years old, alone, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hatred hot enough to burn down the world. He moved west, guided only by the North Star and the desperate need to put distance between himself and the noose. For 3 days, he was a ghost in the brush. He drank from muddy cattle tracks and ate berries that made his stomach cramp. He slept in bursts, waking at the snap of a twig, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew they were coming. Whitmore never let property walk away. He would hire the slave catchers, men who hunted humans for sport and profit, men with dogs bred to tear flesh. On the 4th morning, the sound he dreaded most drifted on the wind, the baying of hounds. It was a primal, terrifying sound that triggered an adrenaline dump so massive it nearly made him vomit. They were close. He could hear the shouts of men on horseback, the heavy thud of hooves on the dry earth. Zachariah pushed his body beyond exhaustion, sprinting through the scrub oak and mesquite. But he was a boy on foot against men on horses. The gap was closing. He reached a dry creek bed, his legs failing him, stumbling over roots and stones. The dogs were loud now, their barks frantic with the scent of prey. He was trapped. Panic threatened to seize him, to freeze him in place for the slaughter. But then he saw it. A small, dark opening beneath the twisted roots of a massive dead oak on the creek bank. A hollow just large enough for a fox or a starving boy. He squeezed himself into the earth, forcing his body into the damp, claustrophobic darkness of the root system. He pulled dead leaves and mud over the opening, sealing himself in a tomb of his own making. He lay there, pressed against the wet soil, holding his breath until his chest burned. The dogs arrived moments later. He could hear them sniffing just inches above his head, their claws scratching at the dirt. He could hear the heavy breathing of the horses and the voices of the catchers. "Lost the trail at the water," one man cursed. "Circle back. He couldn't have gone far." The dogs whined, confused by the scent vanishing into the earth. For an hour they searched the area, boots stomping the ground directly over Zachariah's face. He lay paralyzed, staring into the pitch black, gripping the handle of the rusted knife. If they found him, he wouldn't go back. He would die right here in this hole. But the earth protected him. Eventually the voices faded, the barking grew distant. Zachariah stayed in the hole until nightfall, long after the sounds of pursuit had vanished. When he finally crawled out, covered in mud and shaking from hypothermia and shock, he was a different creature. The boy who had run from the plantation was gone. In his place stood a survivor. He looked out at the vast, indifferent landscape of the West, a land of predators, outlaws, and endless horizons. He had no food, no weapons, and no allies. But he was free. And for the first time, the darkness of the night didn't scare him. He was the darkness now. He turned his face toward the setting sun and began to walk, stepping into a future written in violence. The hunt had begun, but the catchers didn't know it yet. The prey had just become the predator. For the next 3 years, Zachariah ceased to be a boy and became a creature of the wilderness. The West Texas frontier was not the manicured, blood-soaked cotton fields of his youth. It was a vast, indifferent purgatory of scrub brush, limestone, and relentless sky. This was Comanche territory, a lawless expanse where the United States Army was a rumor and civilization was a distant memory. Here, a black boy without papers or a master could vanish completely, provided he didn't die of exposure first. Survival was a brutal tutor. He learned through agony and near misses. He learned which cactus held water and which berries would stop his heart. He learned to track distinct game trails, reading the disturbed earth like a book written in dust. He learned to sleep with one ear pressed to the ground, listening for the vibration of hooves miles away. The wilderness was cruel, stripping the softness from his bones, but it was honest. The sun didn't burn him because of his race. The rattlesnake didn't strike him because he was property. In the wild, you either adapted or you perished. There were no overseers here, no whips, no arbitrary punishments, only the binary law of life and death. Zachariah embraced this cold logic. He became hard, lean, and watchful, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. The soft parts of him, the parts that had once known how to love a mother or a sister, retreated deep inside, encased in scar tissue where nothing could touch them ever again. By the time he turned 15, Zachariah had survived trials that would have broken grown men. He had cut snake venom from his own calf with a stolen flint knife, shivering through the night as the poison fought his blood. He had endured blue northers, sudden freezing storms that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an hour, by burying himself in piles of decaying leaves like an animal. But the most significant transformation occurred when he first took a human life. It happened in a dry arroyo near the Pecos River. A white drifter, a man with teeth rotted to black stumps and eyes that shifted like oil on water, found Zachariah sleeping. To the drifter, the boy was just a runaway stray, a potential payday if returned to the right buyer. The man attacked with a rusty bowie knife and a grin, expecting easy prey. He underestimated the boy. Zachariah didn't fight with panic. He fought with the cold, focused rage of a cornered wolf. He smashed a jagged rock into the man's temple, then used the man's own knife to finish it. As he stood over the body, watching the life drain into the thirsty sand, Zachariah waited for the guilt to come. He waited for the horror. It never arrived. Instead, he felt a chilling satisfaction. One less monster in the world, one less pair of hands that would ever hurt anyone again. He took the man's boots, his coat, and his knife, and walked away without looking back. In the spring of 1863, delirium finally caught him. Racked with a fever that made the world spin and his joints burn, a starving Zachariah stumbled into a hidden canyon deep in the Guadalupe Mountains. He collapsed at the edge of a campfire, half dead, surrendering to the darkness. He expected to wake up in chains, or not to wake up at all. Instead, he opened his eyes to the smell of roasting rabbit and the sight of an old man watching him. The stranger was Mexican, his face a map of deep fissures and old scars, framed by a shock of grey hair. He sat cleaning a beautifully engraved revolver, a rifle resting easily across his knees. He radiated a stillness that was more terrifying than any threat. "You look like death, boy," the old man said, his voice like grinding stones. "You plan on dying in my camp?" Zachariah, his throat parched, rasped out, "Not planning to die anywhere, not yet." The old man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good," he replied, tossing a strip of meat onto the dirt near Zachariah's hand. "Dying is the easy part, living with what you have to do to survive. That is the hard work. Eat. You're too skinny to kill." The old man was Joaquin Esperanza. To the governments of Mexico and the United States, Esperanza was a ghost, a bandit king who had been reported dead a dozen times over the last decade. In his youth, he had been a legend, a guerrilla fighter who waged a personal war against the encroaching Americans after the Mexican-American War stripped his people of their land. He had robbed stagecoaches carrying California gold, ambushed army patrols, and dispensed his own brand of bloody justice across the borderlands. He was a hero to the displaced and a devil to the settlers. But vengeance is a heavy coat to wear for a lifetime. Weary of the bloodshed and the constant looking over his shoulder, Joaquin had staged his death one last time and retreated to this remote canyon to fade away in peace. He had built a small cabin, planted a garden, and tried to bury his past. But when Zachariah stumbled into his firelight, Joaquin saw something that shattered his solitude. He saw a mirror. "You have the eyes," Joaquin told him a week later as Zachariah's strength began to return. "The eyes of a man who has already decided to kill. Who is it you hate so much, boy?" Zachariah had not spoken of his past since leaving the plantation. Silence had been his shield. But something about Joaquin, the shared exile, the unspoken understanding of violence, cracked the dam. That night, under a canopy of stars, Zachariah spilled everything. He told Joaquin of Abigail's whipping, of the sound the milk jug made when it broke, of Grace's small hand reaching out from the wagon, of Samuel kicking at the end of a rope. He recited the list of names he kept in his head like a litany: Thomas Birch, William Crawford, Colonel Whitmore. When he finished, the silence in the canyon was heavy. Joaquin stared into the embers for a long time before speaking. "You want revenge?" he said softly. "I understand this thirst. It drove me for 20 years. But listen to me. Wanting is not enough. You are angry, yes, but you are clumsy. You are untrained. You have hate, but they have guns, money, and the law. If you go back now, you will be dead in a week." Zachariah looked at the old gunfighter, his resolve hardening. "Then teach me," he said. "Teach me how to be the thing that kills them." Joaquin sighed, the weight of his own history pressing down on him. "I came here to stop killing," he murmured, "to let my sins sleep." He looked at the boy, this raw nerve of pain and potential, and shook his head. "Why did you save me?" Zachariah pressed. "Why feed me if you didn't want this?" Joaquin met his gaze, and for a moment the lethal mask slipped. "Because I was you once," Joaquin admitted. "Because I know what it is to have the world take everything you love and leave you with nothing but a knife and a grudge. I suppose I am paying a debt to the universe." He stood up, his joints cracking in the cold night air. "I will teach you, but understand this. Once you step onto this path, there is no turning back. You are asking to become a monster to fight monsters. The training will break you, and if you survive it, you will never be able to sleep soundly again. Killers do not get peace." Zachariah didn't hesitate. "I don't want peace," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I want justice." Joaquin nodded slowly. "Then we begin at dawn." And so, in the forgotten canyon, the education of Zachariah Creed began. For 4 years, the canyon became a crucible. Joaquin Esperanza did not teach Zachariah to fight. He taught him to become a weapon. The training was a systematic dismantling of the boy's limitations. The first year was physical agony. Zachariah learned to fight with knives, with rocks, with his bare hands, absorbing the dirty, pragmatic street fighting of Mexico City and the silent, lethal grappling of the Apache. He was beaten daily, his body hardening under the blows until pain became information rather than a deterrent. The second year was the mastery of steel. Joaquin, once the most feared pistolier on the border, passed his dark art to his student. Zachariah learned to shoot not with his eye, but with his instinct. He practiced drawing until the motion was a blur, firing at moving targets while rolling through the dirt, clearing jams by touch in the pitch black. By the third year, the focus shifted inward. Joaquin introduced strategy. They played chess by the firelight, analyzing the geometry of violence. "Rage is a fire," the old man would say, tapping his temple. "It burns hot and consumes everything, including you. Vengeance is a cold coal. You keep it buried, you feed it just enough air to stay alive, and you unleash it only when the trap is set. Never before." Zachariah learned patience. He learned to become still, to silence the screaming in his mind until he was as empty and dangerous as the desert itself. On the morning of his 20th birthday, the education ended. Joaquin, now frail and moving with the stiffness of a man whose time was short, called Zachariah to the edge of the canyon. "You are ready," he said, his voice raspy with age, "or as ready as a man can be to lose his soul." He reached into a velvet-wrapped bundle and pulled out a pair of 1851 Navy Colts, their ivory grips yellowed like old bone. "These were mine when I was the devil they feared. They have taken more lives than I can count. Now they are yours." He handed them over, heavy and cold. "But hear me, Zachariah. Killing changes the shape of you. Every man you drop carves a piece out of your spirit that you will never get back. You think you are balancing the scales, but you are only digging two graves. If you survive this, if you ever want to stop running, come back here. The cabin will be waiting." Zachariah holstered the guns. They felt like extensions of his own hands. "I stopped worrying about my soul the day they whipped my mother to death," he replied softly. "They made me this. Now they can die by what they created." 3 days later, he rode out of the mountains, a ghost returning to the world of the living. The first name on the list was Thomas Birch. The Civil War had ended, slavery was abolished, and the old order had collapsed, scattering the perpetrators like rats from a sinking ship. It took Zachariah 2 months of tracking to find him. Birch had drifted west to a dusty cattle town called Dusty Creek, working as a ranch hand and drinking away his wages. He was no longer the terrifying overseer. He was a bloated, red-faced drunkard who bored patrons with stories of his glory days, disciplining slaves. Zachariah watched him for a week, learning his routine, his slow draw, his dull reflexes. On the chosen day, Zachariah walked into the saloon. The silence that followed him was absolute. He stopped at Birch's table. "Thomas Birch," he said, his voice barely a whisper yet carrying across the room. The man looked up, eyes bleary. "Who's asking?" Zachariah leaned in. "August 18th, 1858. You whipped a woman named Abigail 37 times. She died screaming." Recognition dawned in Birch's eyes, not of the man, but of the sin. He scrambled for his gun, but Zachariah was faster than thought. The Colt flashed. "God remembers," Zachariah said. The bullet took Birch in the forehead before his weapon cleared leather. He fell face forward into his cards, dead before he hit the table. Zachariah walked out before the smoke cleared, leaving a town wondering if they had seen a man or a phantom. Next was William Crawford, the slave trader who had sold Grace. Finding him required a different kind of hunting. Crawford had reinvented himself as a respectable cotton broker in Houston, living in a mansion, attending church, and washing his blood money in legitimate commerce. He was insulated by wealth and guarded by hired guns. But Zachariah discovered Crawford's vice, a private gentleman's club on the outskirts of the city where he drank expensive whiskey every Tuesday night, alone. Zachariah infiltrated the club through a service entrance, moving through the shadows like smoke. He found Crawford in a private parlor. When the door clicked shut, Crawford looked up, annoyed, only to freeze at the sight of the tall figure in black. "You're him," Crawford breathed, the rumors of the black ghost having reached even polite society. Zachariah wasted no time. "In 1859, you bought a 6-year-old girl named Grace from the Whitmore plantation. Where is she?" He raised the pistol. Crawford began to weep, terrifyingly ordinary in his cowardice. "I don't know. I bought hundreds. I don't keep records of merchandise. She could be anywhere. Louisiana, Mississippi. I don't remember." The truth hit Zachariah harder than a bullet. Crawford truly didn't remember. Grace was just a line item in a ledger to him, a transaction forgotten the moment the cash changed hands. She was lost to history, swallowed by the vast, anonymous cruelty of the trade. The hope of finding her, which had burned in Zachariah for a decade, was extinguished in that opulent room. Crawford, sensing his end, began to bargain. "I have money. I can help you look. Take whatever you want." Zachariah looked at the man with eyes that were ancient and dead. "You took the only thing I had," he said, his voice devoid of mercy. "She screamed my name, and you didn't even look back." Crawford fell to his knees, sobbing. "Please, I have a family." Zachariah cocked the hammer. "When you get to hell, tell them Zachariah sent you. Tell them the debt is paid." The gunshot was muffled by the heavy velvet drapes. Zachariah left Crawford slumped in his chair, a glass of spilled bourbon dripping onto the expensive rug, and vanished into the night. The list was getting shorter, but the hole inside him was only getting deeper. The months that followed bled into a dark legend that swept across Texas like a prairie fire. Zachariah did not stop with Crawford. The list in his head was long, and he attended to it with the grim efficiency of an undertaker. Sheriff James Thornton, the man who had ordered Samuel's hanging with a casual wave of his hand, was found dead in his own jail cell, a single note pinned to his chest that read simply, "Remembered." Dr. Robert Hayes, a physician who had used his medical knowledge to brand runaways on their faces so they could never hide, was discovered in his clinic with his own branding iron pressed cold against his forehead. Two former overseers from the Whitmore Estate met their ends within days of each other, one shot in a stable, the other in his bed. The pattern was terrifyingly consistent, a single bullet, a ghost that left no tracks, and a message that the past was not dead. The bounty on the Black Ghost soared to $5,000, a fortune in the Reconstruction South. Texas Rangers were deployed, posses were formed, and bounty hunters scoured the plains. But Zachariah moved through the landscape like smoke. He was everywhere and nowhere, aided by the whispers of the black community who saw him not as a killer, but as a reckoning, an avenging angel for every crime that had gone unpunished. By the summer of 1875, only one name remained, Colonel Henry Whitmore. The years had not been kind to the former master. The war had destroyed his fortune, the emancipation had stripped him of his property, and the collapse of the cotton market had left him with nothing but a crumbling mansion and a bitter, festering rage. Whitmore knew he was being hunted. He had heard the stories of Birch and Crawford. He knew the ghost was circling closer. Paranoia consumed him. He turned his decaying plantation into a fortress, spending his last remaining gold to hire 20 hard-bitten gunfighters to guard the perimeter day and night. He barricaded the windows, locked the doors, and sat in his study with a bottle of whiskey and a shotgun, waiting. "Let him come," Whitmore would mutter to the empty room, his hands trembling with age and fear. "I'll hang him from the same tree. I'll show him who the master is." But deep down, beneath the bluster and the bourbon, Whitmore was terrified. He knew that the boy he had broken had returned as a man he could not control. On the moonless night of September 15th, Zachariah finally arrived. He did not ride in with guns blazing. He came as the darkness itself. He slipped through the overgrown cotton fields, past the rotting slave quarters where his mother had died, and approached the mansion. The 20 hired guns were on high alert, but they were fighting a shadow. Zachariah began to dismantle the defenses with surgical precision. A guard on the perimeter fell without a sound. Then another. Panic began to ripple through the mercenaries as muzzle flashes erupted from the darkness, targeting lanterns and plunging the grounds into chaos. The men fired blindly into the night, wasting ammunition on phantoms. Zachariah moved constantly, firing from one position and appearing in another seconds later, creating the illusion of an army. He set fire to the outbuildings, the flames casting dancing, demonic shadows against the peeling white paint of the mansion. Realizing they were being picked off one by one for a man who couldn't pay them enough to die, the remaining gunmen broke. They threw down their weapons and fled into the night, leaving the colonel alone in his castle of dust. Zachariah kicked open the front door, the wood splintering inward. He walked through the familiar halls, now stripped of their grandeur, his spurs ringing on the floorboards where his mother had once scrubbed milk from the cracks. He found Whitmore in the parlor, huddled behind an overturned sofa, weeping. The colonel fired his shotgun wildly, hitting only the ceiling before Zachariah disarmed him with a casual slap of his pistol barrel. Whitmore scrambled backward, crawling like a crab until he hit the wall. He looked up at the towering figure in black, his eyes wide with the recognition of his own doom. "Please," the old man whimpered, dignity forgotten. "I'll give you anything. The land, the house. Just let me go." Zachariah stood over him, the Colt heavy in his hand, looking down at the architect of his suffering. He remembered the whip. He remembered the auction block. He remembered the hanging tree. For a long moment, the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Zachariah thumbed the hammer back, the click echoing like a thunderclap in the small room. Whitmore squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the end, but the shot never came. Zachariah slowly lowered the hammer. "I'm not going to kill you," he said, his voice cold and flat. Whitmore opened his eyes, hope flickering desperately. You're letting me go?" Zachariah shook his head. "No, death is too easy for you. It's too quick." He holstered his gun and leaned down, his face inches from the trembling old man. "You are going to live, Whitmore. You are going to live right here in the ruin of everything you built. You will wake up every morning knowing that a slave beat you. You will watch your legacy rot, and every shadow you see, every creak of the floorboards, you will wonder if I have come back to finish it." Zachariah straightened up, looking around the decaying room. "You get to live with the fear. You get to remember just like we had to." He turned and walked out the door, leaving the colonel sobbing in the wreckage of his life. Whitmore did live, just as Zachariah promised. He spent his final years in a sanatorium, screaming at ghosts, dying alone and insane in 1883. As for Zachariah Creed, he vanished into the night and was never seen in Texas again. Rumors swirled for decades. Some said he went to Mexico to die. Others claimed he rode north to Canada. But in the quiet corners of the borderlands, a different story was whispered. They said a man returned to a hidden canyon in the Guadalupe Mountains, to a small cabin with a garden. They said he buried an old Mexican gunfighter named Joaquin Esperanza overlooking the valley, and then hung up his guns forever. The truth of his final days is lost to history, buried like the unmarked graves of the plantation. But the legend remained. The story of Zachariah, the name that means God remembers, became a parable passed down through generations. It is a reminder that history does not forget, that debts are eventually called in, and that while laws may change, the scars of the past are permanent. The story asks us not to seek revenge, but to bear witness, to remember the names, the crimes, and the survival. For in the end, memory is the only justice that truly lasts. The ghost of Zachariah Creed is gone, but the echo of his boots still walks the dusty roads of memory, warning us that nothing is ever truly forgotten.